Hi, my name is Phillip Hedayatnia. I'm a rising senior at the Hawken School in Cleveland, Ohio, and this is my overview of preliminary legislation item 7, which is a resolution to close U.S. military bases in Okinawa at the 2015 NSDA National Tournament. So this is a resolution, first of all, and so we can talk about the substance more than we talk about the details. What this legislation very clearly does is it closes all of the military bases in Okinawa, which is in Japan, of course, and it also says we're going to cancel all plans to construct new bases. Basically, we're just getting rid of all of our bases in Okinawa. This is actually a pretty simple piece of legislation to understand. And I'll put it to you this way from the beginning. It is much easier to argue the affirmative than it is to argue the negation. That should give you a clue that to look for negative arguments, but it's easier to argue the affirmative. Here's just a few reasons why we should get out. First of all, we have military bases in a ton of places, like a ton, everywhere around the world. They cost us billions of dollars, and we honestly never use them. The Okinawa bases are very rarely being used. They don't really do much good at all. They're just a giant waste of money. And if you look at the map of bases around the world, we've got bases like everywhere. And so in reality, that poses, when Russia and China complain about the US's military presence, they actually probably do have a complaint because we've got bases everywhere. We have bases all over the world in random countries that we really have never fought a war in for like 30, 40 years. We don't have really a reason to be there, seemingly. So there doesn't seem to be a reason to stay in Okinawa. The people of Okinawa also really hate that we have the U.S. military presence, and they've been protesting it for years. It's causing a severe problem within Japan's own politics as well, because despite the fact that the Japanese government likes the bases, the Japanese people do not like the bases, and that's pretty universal around the world. Generally, even when there's government support for U.S. bases and a U.S. presence, most people really hate the fact we're there, and that isn't any different in Japan. So the thing about this piece of legislation as well is that there's a lot of articles arguing, bring the troops home, let Japan defend Japan. And here's another reason, there's one that I was looking at from Doug Bando at Cato Institute that was written on the Huffington Post called U.S. Should Close Bases in Okinawa, Bring Troops Home, and Let Japanese Defend Japan. And they say that the U.S. is overburdened militarily and effectively bankrupt financially, but Washington is determined to preserve every base in deployment, no matter how archaic. A lot of people look at this as kind of a product of the military-industrial complex, that that's the only reason why we still have the bases open. What I'm going to tell you as well is there's also some implications in terms of geopolitics, because, and this is something that is an argument that can be spun on both sides. So here's what happens when we go and we put a lot of our military in South Korea and in Japan and in Australia, okay? They are worried, honestly, about China's presence. China's military presence. They are worried because China just keeps on buying weapons. There's something called the better in Beijing effect, and what it essentially is that when China sees that we are putting all of our troops everywhere in the South China Sea, when we're putting troops closer to them, it incentivizes China, due to many nationalists within the government, to also spend money, which means that China then has more guns, and we have more guns, and we're never going to use them. But what it means is if we leave, then we put the countries we're in a bad situation because they then have no real means of defending themselves. And that is absolutely true in Australia, and that is absolutely true in Japan, and that is absolutely true in South Korea. And so that's a very serious thing. They don't really have a way of defending themselves if China were to ever use the weapons that they have there. And that's something that worries them. Now, it's more of a worry than it is a reality, but it is a worry, and it's something that worries them a lot. And so, despite the fact that the Japanese people don't like the bases, honestly, Japan needs the bases. Now, an argument could be made that, well, we shouldn't be continuing the bases because it's continuing the bases that has led to that dependency, because that's exactly what's happened. They're basically dependent on us. And so maybe the right course of action would be to get out. And I think there's a very good case to be made for that. But the negative response to that is pretty simple. What you should be doing is you should be taking it out slowly and you should be making sure that that the Japanese government is also investing in their own defense. But don't think that's the end of it. If you're on the affirmative, don't think that's the final word, because remember, this is a resolution. And the fact that it's a resolution gives you the leeway you need to navigate around that negative point. Because what you can argue is it's a resolution, which means we can actually only, get out of the region over time. It means we can ensure that we only get out of the region if Japan invests. So you can use the fact that this is a resolution to navigate around that a little bit. That's the primary point, I think, on the affirmative, which is that we should be closing the bases because they've caused dependency within Japan. And so we're spending a ton of money, just a ton. We are spending a ton of money, and we are not really getting much for it, except we are making them dependent on us. So you can definitely say that. An argument why we shouldn't be closing U.S. military bases in Okinawa is that we are going to be pulling out way too soon, and it's going to throw them in jeopardy. And it also, the tough thing there is this is all theory, but you don't want to throw them in jeopardy because they are totally without any means of defending themselves, and that's pretty bad. The other thing is, and this is big, we use the Okinawa bases in many cases to have a presence that would allow us to kind of fight against North Korea. And here's what I just want to quote Bill Friedel on this because I want to make sure I'm saying it right. Japan, so our presence in Japan has made South Korea safer in many ways. It makes it harder for North Korea to launch any sort of attacks because we are very close by. And that's kind of a weak argument to run because we do have bases closer to North Korea, but that is actually something that could be run. So you could also argue, you could also argue that, that's going to threaten our relationship with Japan, or that it's going to threaten our relationship with South Korea, or any of that. But the bottom line is that we do not get much in terms of geopolitical benefits from the military bases in Okinawa. And so whatever points you end up making on the negation, saying that we shouldn't be closing them, have to either be on technicalities, meaning that you can argue that the legislation gets out way too quickly, or they have to be on substance, but you have to be in a way twisting the situation around. So you need to argue that it's gonna leave our allies high and dry, that it's gonna threaten things geopolitically, stuff like that. So it's a tough bill to argue in the negation on. It's also a bill that requires a lot of nuance. So you also have to judge by your chamber whether or not this is going to come up, because if your chamber is looking at everything in foreign policy, if they really like foreign policy, if they really like a lot of nuance and debate, if you think that they're actually picking up on all of these more complex points about geopolitics, then they might be more willing to rank this highly. They might be more willing to have longer and better debate on this. If they're not doing that, if they're not up for it, you're not going to have good debate on it, or you're not going to discuss it. People are not going to favor it in that case. So that's just an overview of that bill. Essentially, the best arguments are geopolitics, money, and foreign policy.